He jumped and screamed, and as he did, the face of the thing came up towards him. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. He screamed again and rushed to the door. He felt the thing touch his back and start to tear at his shirt. Things in the night, things in the house, screaming, running, staring. In these stories, there are things that are worse than your worst dreams. Giant black spiders living in a tree, the terrible ghost that waits outside a window, empty clothes that walk, the strange thin woman who moves through a man's picture, the boy with the long, dirty fingernails and a hole in his chest, the woman who screams from the bottom of a lake, and the dry, dusty old man who reads but has no eyes. Here are 9 stories like no others you have read. Montague Rhodes James was born in 1862 in a village in Kent, in the south of England, where his father was a vicar from an early age. He loved old books and studied history, the Bible, languages, and the books of past centuries at Cambridge University. He studied, lived, and worked at the university from 1882 to 1918. He began to write ghost and horror stories after reading the stories of Irish writer Sheridan Le Fanu. From the early 1890s, he read one of his own stories to friends at Christmas every year. His great knowledge of history gave his stories an unusual amount of detail, and his ghosts seem more real and are more frightening than those of almost any other writer. M.R. James died in 1936. Chapter 1, The Ash Tree. Visitors to Castringham Hall in Suffolk will find it almost unchanged from the days when our story took place. They can still see the beautiful old house with its gardens and lake. However, the one thing missing is the ash tree which used to stand, proud and tall, in front of the house, its branches almost touching the walls. Visitors to Castringham Hall in Suffolk will find it almost unchanged from the days when our story took place. They can still see the beautiful old house with its gardens and lake. However, the one thing missing is the ash tree which used to stand, proud and tall, in front of the house, its branches almost touching the walls. He said that she usually carried a strange knife to cut off parts of the tree, and that she talked to herself. Once he followed her home, but she disappeared, and when he knocked on the door of her house, she came downstairs in her nightclothes, looking sleepy. He said that she usually carried a strange knife to cut off parts of the tree, and that she talked to herself. Once he followed her home, but she disappeared, and when he knocked on the door of her house, she came downstairs in her nightclothes, looking sleepy. After the hanging, Sir Matthew felt uncomfortable and guilty, and he told his friend the vicar about his worries. "You did the right thing, Sir Matthew," were the wise words of the vicar. "I'm sure she was a dangerous woman." Sir Matthew felt happier. That evening, Sir Matthew and the vicar went for a walk in the gardens of Castringham Hall. It was the night of the full moon. As they were returning to the house, Sir Matthew pointed to the ash tree in great surprise. "What kind of animal is that running down the ash tree? It looks very strange." The vicar only saw the moving animal for a moment, but he thought that it had more than 4 legs. He shook his head. "I must be tired," he thought to himself. "After all, what animal has more than 4 legs?" He said nothing to Sir Matthew, but just wished him good night. The next morning, Sir Matthew's servants were surprised not to find him downstairs at his usual time of 6 o'clock. When 7 o'clock and then 8 o'clock passed, they began to suspect that something was terribly wrong, and they went up to his bedroom. The door was locked. After knocking several times and still getting no answer from inside, they broke down the door and entered, to find that their fears were right. Sir Matthew S. body lay on the bed, dead and completely black. There were no wounds or other marks on him, and everything in the room looked as usual, except that the window was wide open. His servants at first suspected poison, but the doctor who was called found no such thing and could offer no real explanation for Sir Matthew's death. When he heard the news, the vicar rushed to Castringham Hall, and, while he was waiting to hear the doctor's opinion, he looked at Sir Matthew's Bible, which was lying on a table by the dead man's bedside. He opened the book, and the first words he read were from the book of Luke, chapter 8. Cut it down were the words he read. The servants locked Sir Matthew's room that day, and it stayed locked up for the next 40 years. By that time, Sir Richard Fell, Sir Matthew's grandson, was living at Castringham Hall. He enjoyed spending money, especially on rebuilding parts of the hall. He also decided to make the local church bigger so that his family could have a fine new seat in the new part of the church. In order to complete this building work, some of the graves in the graveyard had to be moved. One of the graves was that of Mrs. Mothersole, the old witch who began this story. The villagers were excited about the opening of her grave, and a crowd came to watch. However, they and the workmen were amazed to find the grave completely empty. No body, no bones, no dust. At about this time, Sir Richard started to sleep very badly. The wind made his fire smoke, and the curtains move, and, because his room faced east, the sun woke him up early in the morning. One morning he asked his servant to help him choose a better room, and he made a tour of the house, finding something wrong with each room. Each one was either too cold or too noisy, or it faced the wrong direction. Finally, he found himself outside his grandfather's old room. His servant tried to persuade him not to go in. "It's a bad room, sir. They say terrible things happened in there, and no one has opened the door since the death of your grandfather. Also, the ash tree is right outside the window, and that's always unlucky, sir." But Sir Richard was not listening. He unlocked the door and walked straight in. "See? Nothing unusual in here, James," he said, and he opened the window. As he did so, he noticed how tall and dark the ash tree was. Its branches seemed to be trying to reach into the room. But he said nothing. At that moment, a stranger rang the bell at the front door of the hall. The servant brought him up to the bedroom, where Sir Richard was standing, looking around him at the old paintings and old books. "I must apologize for interrupting you, Sir Richard," said the stranger, "but please allow me to introduce myself. My name is William Crome. My grandfather was the vicar here in your grandfather's time. I have some papers to deliver to you." "Delighted to meet you," said Sir Richard. "James, please bring us some wine in the library, and then move my clothes and things into this room for me. I will sleep here in future." While he was drinking a glass of wine with William Crome in the library, Sir Richard looked at the papers, many of which belonged to his grandfather. Among them, he found the notes made by the old vicar about the day of Sir Matthew's mysterious death. "Well, well," said Sir Richard, laughing quietly. "How very interesting. It seems that my grandfather's Bible gave a piece of advice on the day he died, and your grandfather thought it could be about that old ash tree outside the bedroom window." "Cut it down," the good book told him. "Those were the first words your grandfather saw when he opened the Bible on the day of my grandfather's death." "Do you still have that old Bible?" asked William Crome. I'd very much like to see it." Sir Richard found the old Bible easily. "Yes, here it is. A bit dusty, I'm afraid. Let's see what it has to tell me. I'll open it at any page and read the first words I see, just as your grandfather did." He opened the book, and his eyes fell on the words, "You shall look for me in the morning, and I shall not be here." Sir Richard was sure that the words were again about the ash tree. The Bible was crying to give him some advice. He ordered some of his servants to cut it down the next day. But Sir Richard did not live to see them cut the ash tree down. That night, at exactly midnight, a strange and terrible animal jumped from Sir Richard's bed, ran silently to the window, and disappeared into the shadowy branches of the enormous tree. No one was there to see it, but the next morning they found Sir Richard's body, like his grandfather's, dead and completely black. When William Crome heard the news of his new friend's death, the words from the Bible came back to him. "You shall look for me in the morning, and I shall not be here." He immediately hurried to Castringham Hall, where he found the family and servants crowded round the ash tree. "Sir Richard's last orders were that we should cut down this tree," explained James, and then, in a quieter voice, he went on, "And there's something very strange about that tree, sir. Very strange. It's hollow, and they say something lives inside it." The gardener put his ladder against the tree and climbed up to look inside. As he held a light over the hole, his face suddenly looked so terrified that several of the people watching from below screamed and turned to run. The gardener himself fell off the ladder, dropping his lamp down into the hollow tree, which quickly caught fire. As the tree started to burn, the crowd saw an animal run from the tree. They screamed in horror as they saw its shape and size. It looked like an enormous spider, about the same size as a man's head, and covered all over with gray hair. "Look, there's another, and another," someone shouted. For a long time, the men watched these terrifying animals, trying to escape from the fire one after another, and then they killed them with sticks. At last, the fire burned itself out, and William Crome, James the servant, and some of the braver people went to look inside the blackened tree. There they found the bones of a human being. The doctors who examined it afterwards said that it was the body of a woman who died around 1690, the year that old Mrs. Mothersole was hanged. Chapter 2, A School Story. Two men, John and Edgar, were having dinner together one night when a conversation started on the subject of school days. One of them, John, told the following strange story. "When I went to the school in September of 1870, I immediately became friendly with a Scottish boy called MacLeod. It was a large school, and the teachers changed quite often. One term, a new teacher named Samson came to teach at the school. He taught us Latin. He was tall and pale, with a black beard, and he was popular with the boys because he used to tell us all about his travels to different countries. He always carried an old gold coin in his pocket, which he found on a trip to Turkey, and one day he let us look at this coin closely. On one side of it was the head of a king, I don't know which one, and on the other side of it were the letters GWS for Samson's name, and the date 24th July 1865. We enjoyed Samson's classes because he often asked us to invent sentences of our own instead of always doing the boring exercises in the grammar book. One day he asked us for sentences using the word remember in Latin. We all wrote our sentences in the usual way, and Samson came round to correct each of us. My friend MacLeod seemed to be having some difficulty in thinking of a sentence, and when the bell went for break, I saw him write something very quickly just before Samson reached him. So McLeod's sentence was the last one that Samson corrected that day. I waited outside the classroom for what seemed a long time before my friend at last came out. I guessed that he was in trouble for making a mistake. When he did come out, he was looking thoughtful. "What happened? Was old Samson angry?" I asked. "No, my sentence was all right, I think. I wrote, 'Memento pute inter quatuor taxos,'" said McLeod. "Well, what does all that mean?" I asked. "That's the funny thing," he explained. "I don't really know, you see. I couldn't think of anything to write until just before Samson got to me. Then those words just came into my head from nowhere, and it was very strange. I could see a sort of picture of it in my head. I think it means, 'Remember the well among the 4 trees.' When Samson read it, he went quiet for a long time. Then he started to ask me questions about my family and where I came from. Then he let me go. We soon forgot about the lesson and McLeod's strange sentence, because the next day, McLeod became ill with a cold, and he didn't come to school for a week. Nothing happened for about a month, until one day when we were, again, writing Latin sentences for Samson. This time we had to write them on pieces of paper and give them to him for correction. He started looking through them, but when he got to one piece of paper, he turned white and cried out, looking very frightened. He got up and hurried out of the classroom, and we sat there for a long time, wondering what to do. Finally, I got up to have a look at the papers, and the first thing I noticed was that the top one was in red ink. Our school never allowed us to use red ink. It was against the rules. The sentence on the paper said, "Si tu non veneris ad me, ego veniam ad te," which means, "If you don't come to me, I will come to you." All the boys looked at it, and they all promised that the sentence was not theirs. To check, I counted the pieces of paper. There were 17 of them, but there were only 16 boys in the class. Where this paper came from, no one could say. I put it in my pocket, and it wasn't until that afternoon that I took it out again. It was completely white, with no sign of the red writing on it anywhere. I know it was the same piece of paper because I could still see my finger marks on it. Anyway, Samson eventually came back at the end of that lesson and told us we could go. He looked at the papers one by one and probably thought it was his imagination playing tricks. He looked pale and worried. The next day, Samson was in school again, and he seemed quite normal. But it was that night that the third strange thing happened. It was about midnight when I suddenly woke up. Somebody was shouting at me. It was McLeod, who shared my room. He looked terrified. "Quick," he said. "I think a burglar is trying to get into Samson's room." I rushed to the window, but could see nothing. Somehow, though, I felt that something was wrong out there, and the two of us waited, watching closely. "Tell me exactly what you saw or heard," I whispered. "I didn't hear anything but about 5 minutes before I woke you. I just found myself standing here at the window." McLeod whispered back. There was a terrible-looking man standing just outside Samson's window. He was very tall and very thin, and he didn't really look like a living person at all, more like a ghost. He seemed to be making a sign to Samson to go with him. That's all I saw before I woke you up. We waited a long time, watching, but we saw nothing more that night. Everything was quiet outside. We woke up feeling tired and strange in the morning. But during the day, the news went round that no one could find Samson anywhere, and he didn't come for our Latin class that day. In fact, we never heard of or saw Samson again. Somehow, McLeod and I knew that we should keep quiet about what he had seen that night, and we never told anyone. "It's a good story, John," said Edgar, listening to his friend as he finished his wine. "A very good one. But now, I really must be on my way home. I hope I don't meet any strange, thin men on the way." The two men laughed, shook hands, and went their different ways. It was about a year later that Edgar, the listener to John's story, traveled to Ireland to visit another friend who lived in an old country house there. One evening, his host was looking in a box full of various old things for a key that he wanted. Suddenly, he pulled a small object out of the box and held it up. "Have a look at this, Edgar. What do you think it is?" he asked. It was an old gold coin with the head of a king on the front. Edgar looked closely. "Where did you get it?" he asked quietly. "Well, it's quite an interesting story," began his friend. "A year or two ago, we were working on that area of the garden over there in the corner. Can you see? Among the 4 trees. Right in the middle of the trees, we found an old well, and at the bottom of it, you'll never guess what we found." "Yes, I will." "Was it a body, by any chance?" asked Edgar. His friend was surprised. "Yes, it was. In fact, we found 2 bodies. One of them had its arms tightly around the other. They were probably there for 30 years or more. Anyway, we pulled them out, and in the pocket of one of them, we found this old coin from Turkey or somewhere, by the look of it. It's got something on the back of it, too. Can you see what it says?" "Yes, I think I can," said Edgar. "It seems to be the letters GWS and the date 24th July 1865.
The end.